Thank you so much, everyone. Can I join the choir?
Yeah!
I'd love to. Wow. What an amazing space. What an amazing group. It's so akin, the feeling is so akin to restorative justice. Affirming the bonds of our interrelatedness. Affirming that part of us which is all things. Respect, relationship, responsibility. And bringing in, being present, all of us, not just the head, the body, the spirit, the emotions. It feels so familiar. And it's so good to be here, and it's so good to be among so many young people. Oh, there's a few, I see a few elders in the audience. Raphael and Carl and Paloma. Usually when I'm in audiences, I ask the people who are under 30 to stand up. I think in this audience, we'll have to ask the people who are over 50 to stand up. But it's so good to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. I think of Maya Angelou's quote, "My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive. And to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style." And I add some rhythm to it. So that mission statement really describes Maya, right? I think it describes y'all too. I also want to honor the ancestors of this land, the Oloni, the Pomo, acknowledging that this is a post-genocidal land, an occupied land that we stand on. And also acknowledging that this is a post-slavery land. And we have yet as a nation to tell the truth about the genocide, tell the truth about the slavery, take responsibility for it, and repair the harm to the degree possible. And that is something that I think restorative justice can be a vehicle to allow us to do. I was going to ask you how you felt about the elections, but I think we went through all of that. And probably like many of you, I felt I was in shock, I was numb, low energy. But before long, within a matter of days, that anger and the feeling that I had transformed itself, it transmuted itself, and now there's just a lot of fire. A lot of fire. Knowing... What's that? Oh. Knowing as a person who's worked with indigenous healers, that I need some water too, we need some balance. But I'm just feeling a lot of drive right now, like never before. And I have to be careful because I'm not sleeping as much. I'm not exercising as much. And I was just talking to my partner in the dyad earlier, saying that I'm getting back on track now. I did a yoga class and my Afro-Cuban salsa class yesterday and came here, and that's helping me to come back into balance as well. When Josh called me or wrote me after the election and said, "Well, Fania, we really want you to talk about the elections, even though the theme is restorative justice," I said, sure. But then as I started to gather my thoughts about the election, I realized that I couldn't talk both about the elections and restorative justice in a substantive way. I'm just really starting to clarify my thoughts about the election. And of course, I could talk for days about restorative justice without having to think as much. And to talk in a way that really sort of integrates the two would take a little bit longer for me. But that is something that I am working on as I stand here. So what I want to do, I've got notes, I usually don't speak with notes, but what I want to do is share with you some of the thoughts that I've had about the election. And I probably will end with a little bit of a few thoughts about how restorative justice ties in with our response, or might tie in with our response to the election. By demagogically appealing to the most urgent needs of millions of white Americans who are in pain, while scapegoating the historically marginalized, especially people of color, Donald Trump pulled off the greatest upset in US electoral history. It feels kind of apocalyptic to know that a plurality of white folks seem to have voted in as president a white billionaire who was a climate change denier and is racist, an Islamophobe, a xenophobe, a homophobe, a transphobe, and a misogynist. And it's, you know, I know in my generation, we think of fascism, you know, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Usually fascists are very intentional. They are premeditated. They are calculating ideologues. But we haven't been able to find a particular ideologue in Trump. He's unpredictable. And as Noam Chomsky has said, the closest thing to an ideology in him is me, capital M-E. That's his ideology. Still, his victory raises the specter of fascism. And fascism is really a form of extreme capitalism. It's ruled by the most extreme, reactionary, right-wing elements of capital. Another thing I wanted to say about this election, it sadly follows the historical pattern where we see a period of racial justice progress cyclically followed by backlash. For instance, with the successful movements to abolish slavery and to bring about Reconstruction, where for the first time African Americans voted and held office all over the South, it was followed by the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877. When Hayes was elected, the troops were removed from the South, and Reconstruction was completely eviscerated, all of that progress. And the Ku Klux Klan ruled, and lynchings happened everywhere. And so in contemporary times, with the abolition of Jim Crow, President Reagan, with a significant assist by President Clinton, began eroding the gains of the civil rights movement. It was the Criminal Justice Reform Act which laid the basis for strategies of mass incarceration. It was the evisceration of AFDC that led to greater poverty, especially among people of color, but poor whites as well. And then we had 2 terms of the first black president in our history, accompanied by the historic flourishing of movements like we've never seen before in 8 years. You know, you could say that President Obama didn't do a lot affirmatively he didn't do a lot affirmatively for people of color, for historically marginalized, but his administration created the space for so many movements to bubble up, to emerge with great power, starting with Occupy, the LGBTQ movement, Black Lives Matter, environmental justice. Any others?
Climate justice.
Climate justice.
The native lives.
Native, absolutely. Indigenous movements. We haven't seen anything like this to start. In the space of 8 years, all of this happened. Of course, this has been, and the Dreamers, we didn't talk about the Dreamers, but that period has now been followed by the election of a president who was supported by the KKK and other retrogressive elements. In looking at the present moment, we don't want to lose sight of 4 things. Number 1, Trump did not win the popular vote. Everybody knows that, right? Yeah. In fact, he won the election by about the same number of whites that Mitt Romney lost the election in 2012. You hear a lot about whitelash. And I'm not so sure that the evidence is there. Of course, the victory had a lot to do with the Electoral College, which is a relic of slavery. The Electoral College allowed slaveholding states, which were less populous in terms of white people, but more populous in terms of black slaves, to have increased representation at the national level, with the black slaves being counted as 3/5 of a person. Plus, it was not the majority of white people that voted for Trump. It's so easy, you know, to think that when we talk about whitelash, that most of the white people in this country voted for Trump. Is that the impression you have?
No.
Oh, good. Good. Okay. Good. Yeah. So, in fact, about 50% of eligible voters actually voted, right? And then about 25% of those voters actually elected Donald Trump. I think he got 25.5% of the popular vote, and Hillary got 25.6% of the popular vote. White people are about 70% of the electorate, of those who voted, and that means that Trump got about a quarter of the vote of white people. Is that right? Let's see. I don't think I'm saying it quite right. So if a lot of people didn't vote, half the people, half the white people, half of everybody didn't vote, right? But of the half that did vote, 25% voted for Trump. I think of the ones who voted, whites were about 70% of the electorate. So we're talking about maybe 40 million people, white people, who did vote for Trump. Out of 200 million, 220 million voters. Significant, but not, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call it whitelash, especially when you consider that the same number of white people voted for Romney. It's part of a pattern of who votes for the Republican Party. Young voters preferred Clinton over Trump, 55% to 37%. The second point is that, as Naomi Klein has noted, we blame James Comey and the FBI, we blame voter suppression, we blame whitelash, we blame misogyny, we blame Hillary's personality, we blame third-party candidates, and we blame the corporate media for giving Trump the platform. But as she says, these analyses leave out the factor perhaps most responsible for this disaster. And that is neoliberalism. You've heard that term thrown around a lot recently, right? So basically, neoliberalism is post-New Deal economic policy. It's kind of a rehashing of laissez-faire capitalism. Neoliberalism is allowing capitalism to be free, to roam the world, to do everything it needs to do to increase profit. This insatiable search to create greater and greater and greater profit. So neoliberalism unfetters capitalism. It's basically capitalism on steroids, you could say. And their policies of privatization, of deregulation, of austerity, of free corporate trade. And as a result of these policies, tens of millions, thank you so much, tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs, pensions, and homes. According to the Federal Reserve, 46% of Americans, as a result of these neoliberal policies, could not even come up with $400 in cash in an emergency. 50% of the people in this country. There's a lot of hidden economic crisis. There's a lot of hidden economic pain. And of course, Trump tapped into that. And Clinton was perceived as the establishment candidate who would continue to perpetuate the pain, but Trump would be the one who would give voice to the unheard. He always talks about the forgotten people. But we cannot forget that in embracing Trump, white people expressed their economic pain and also rejected neoliberalism. Third, this election has put our feet to the fire, yeah, in a big way.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. While a Hillary victory might have made us more complacent. It sounds the alarm for us to act decisively to save our planet and to defeat neo-fascism.
Yes.
Noam Chomsky says that the greatest fear that he has right now is that we'll pull out of the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accords, and this global warming will just go crazy. And the planet is at risk in a way that it has never been at risk. As Cornel West has said in the spirit of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, we need to build multiracial alliances to combat poverty, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, misogyny, Wall Street crimes and war crimes, energy industry crimes, global warming and police abuse, and protect precious rights and liberties. Yes, a broad alliance. And you know, almost all of the elements of this broad alliance are in place. We've seen them, they're here. Yeah, the elements are here. Yeah. But you know one is in this room and in the nation, there's one thing that's missing, one element that's missing though. That is white people in economic pain. You know, we've seen all of the elements of this broad alliance emerge with great power over the last 8 years, but we haven't seen white people hurting. And their voice was heard with this election. And it's our job not only to knit together all of the elements of this broad alliance, this broad multiracial alliance against poverty. It's our job to knit those elements together and to pull in white working class people.
All right now.
Yeah. And this broad alliance will look similar to what we saw in Europe. They call them the popular fronts against fascism that arose in the 30s and 40s. Yeah. So fourth, I learned from this election that it's a huge fallacy to think you can be progressive or leftist by challenging devastating gender expression, race, immigration, criminal justice, war, and environmental policies without also naming capitalism as a cause. Without bringing in white working class poor. It's a huge fallacy to think that we can forget about that sector of the population. It's a huge fallacy to ignore capitalism as the force that binds us all together in our suffering. My goodness, if 46% of us can't scrape up $400 in cash in an emergency, we've got to look at these economic issues. And as I said, capitalism is driving this and all of the other unspeakable suffering on our planet. We seem to have lost sight of that. We don't name capitalism. Focusing on the economic harm that was done to the 99%, Occupy started to change that and name capitalism. But it came and went. And later it was the Bernie movement, but that came and went too, with Bernie throwing his support to Hillary. But neither one of these movements were particularly good at also articulating the intersections with the historically marginalized. Did you hear what I'm saying? Yeah. And we, the historically marginalized, haven't been good at articulating our connection and our intersections with those who are poor, especially white working class poor. So Bernie is saying some of the best stuff out there since the elections about the need for the tens of millions to unite in a strong grassroots political force to oppose neo-fascism and to advance a progressive economic agenda. That's great. But he's still stuck on doing it through the Democratic Party. You know? As Audre Lorde says, You can't dismantle the master's house with the tools of the master. Mm-hmm. And the Democratic Party is the master's party. It's a tool of capitalism. It has historically, from time to time, allied itself with progressive forces and the working class, but at bottom, it is a party of the master of the capitalism. So we have all the component parts, all the elements of a force of tens of millions, but a force that is independent, that is moored to the interests of the peace, environmental movements, of the LGBTQ and the Black Lives Matter and people of color movements, and the interests of labor and working class. And it is a force that is, it must be a force that is willing to unapologetically proclaim that capitalism is a force that is hurting us all. And you know, the hopeful thing for me is that 58% of young people, according to a study, prefer socialism over capitalism. And, you know, as I was sitting here, it was so clear to me that the youth are leading the way. And that statistic says it as well. Fifth and last point. I mentioned that I was in a dance class the other day, and we were all talking about Trump. And it occurred to me as we were about to salsa that, gosh, we're all thinking about Trump. We're all talking about Trump. Probably lots of other women and men and lots of other gems and lots of other cities and states are also talking about Trump at the same time. You know, how did this happen? What are we going to do? How are we going to protect our friends? And what about the environment? I'm thinking to myself, what a powerful force this could be with all these people thinking these thoughts. But not the thoughts of fear, not the thoughts of anger, although anger can be a powerful force when transmuted and redirected. What if the thoughts were prayers for the protection of our earth, for the protection of our children, for the protection of Muslims, protection of the dreamers, protection of LGBTQ, of Black people who are at risk for police violence. It was heartening to see the demonstrations all over the country. It wasn't so heartening to see little children with sticks bashing the Trump, what do you call it? The pinata. Yeah. And it wasn't so heartening to see them light fires to burn Trump in effigy. It gave me hope, on the other hand, to see what happened at Broadway the other night when Pence came. And the Hamilton cast, the Hamilton cast did a beautiful statement, You can find it if you just Google Hamilton Pence. Respectful, although Trump said it was harassing and all of that. Actually, Pence said he wasn't offended at all. He enjoyed himself. And my friends, I have so much hope. I received so much from watching the video of the young people at Standing Rock. The International Indigenous Youth Council. They are showing us the way. They marched in silent prayer. They marched all the way to the officers. They looked like soldiers because they were dressed in fatigues and they had rifles and assault weapons at the ready. And there was a barbed wire separating the young people in the hundreds who had been marching in silence. And they arrived at the barbed wire and they kneeled and prayed. And one young man said, "We are here," said to the soldiers, "We are here to pray. We are here to pray for the land. We are here to pray for the people. We are here to pray for the earth. And we are here to pray for you. You in the uniforms." And then they extended some water that had been blessed in ceremony. They put it on the wall. And then one of the soldiers picked up the water dipped his fingers in it, and touched his heart. That gives me great hope. That gives me great hope. And that sort of begins to tie this talk in with restorative justice. This kind of spiritual activism, that these young people so beautifully embodied is what we need. Is what we need to protect the land, to protect the earth, to protect our children, to protect the most vulnerable. So perhaps we might, following their lead, pray that Trump might be divinely guided. Not only pray, right? But, because we need to take action, but in that action is the prayer that he may be divinely guided, that his administration may be divinely guided, to do the right thing, to listen to his highest self, to protect the earth and our children. And may we find ways as activists, as social justice activists, and as people who are healers, because that is what is needed on this earth. To be fearful and to be angry, and they're just flip sides of the same coin, is to increase the collective energy of fear and increase the collective energy of anger. To be violent is to increase the collective energy of violence. And what we need to create, we got plenty of violence, we got plenty of harm. It pervades us, it's all around us. What we need more of is healing. And may we find ways to speak our truth in ways that bring about healing, not stuffing anything. Not in ways that deepen conflict. And not in ways that cause more harm. And that fundamentally is what restorative justice is about. A justice that heals. A justice that responds to harm, not with more harm as our justice system does, but a justice that responds to harm with healing. And I believe that history is asking us to become healers. And so I call upon you to build your capacity even further to walk in this world as both a healer and a warrior. I call upon you to add to your toolkit modalities like restorative justice. I mean, that song, the dance, is also so healing. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you all, and I thank you all for listening to me tonight and for inviting me to be here.